You're fired. Amy Walker wiped down the counter for the third time in 10 minutes, her eyes flicking to the clock. It was almost closing time at Joe's Diner, a small roadside restaurant where she had worked for the past 2 years. The night had been slow, which meant fewer customers and even fewer tips. Something she couldn't afford right now. Rent was due next week, and she barely had enough saved to cover it. The bell above the door jingled. Amy glanced up to see a tall, thin man hesitating at the entrance. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed with dust, and his hair disheveled. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, but exhaustion weighed on his face, like a man who had spent years carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He stepped forward cautiously, stopping at the counter before pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice rough but polite. "What can I get for $5?" Amy glanced at the menu board. The cheapest meal was at least $8. She knew $5 wouldn't get him much, but something in his tired eyes made her decision easy. "You're in luck," she said, offering a warm smile. "We've got a special tonight, one full meal for $5. His eyes flickered with surprise as if he wasn't used to kindness. "Really? Really?" Amy said, already placing the order before he could argue. A few minutes later, she set a steaming plate of food in front of him. He stared at it, then at her. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. Amy shrugged. "Everyone deserves a warm meal." For a brief moment, a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He picked up his fork, but before he could take a bite, a sharp voice cut through the diner. "Amy!" Rick, the diner's manager, strode toward her, his expression a mix of annoyance and suspicion. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing at the plate of food. Amy's stomach tightened. "I paid for it myself," she said calmly. Rick scoffed. "We're not a charity. If you want to feed bums, do it somewhere else." Amy's hands clenched into fists. "He's a veteran." Rick rolled his eyes. "Not my problem." Then, to everyone's shock, he grabbed the plate off the counter and tossed it into the trash. The diner fell silent. Amy's breath caught as she watched the food slide into the garbage. The veteran sat still, his hands resting on his lap, his face unreadable. Rick dusted off his hands as if he had just taken care of something dirty. "Now get back to work." Amy's blood boiled. "You're a disgrace," she said through gritted teeth. Rick smirked. "And you're unemployed." For a moment she thought she had misheard him, but then she saw the way he stood, arms crossed, smirk widening. "You're firing me?" she asked. Rick nodded. "That's right. Grab your things and get out." Amy scanned the room, hoping for someone, anyone, to speak up. The other employees kept their heads down, too afraid to get involved. The few remaining customers sat frozen, whispering among themselves but saying nothing out loud. The veteran slowly stood, his gaze locked on Rick's. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Rick snorted. "I don't owe you anything, old man." The veteran didn't flinch. He nodded once, then turned to Amy. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. Amy forced a small smile, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. "I wish I could have done more." "You already did more than most," he replied before walking toward the door. Amy turned back to Rick. "You are going to regret this." Rick let out a dry laugh. "Doubt it." Amy grabbed her coat and stepped into the cold night, her mind spinning with uncertainty. She had no job, no backup plan, no idea what she was going to do next. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that within 24 hours, everything would change. Amy walked home, her breath visible in the cold night air. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her chest. She had lost her job not because she had done something wrong, but because she had done something right. It felt unfair. It was unfair. She reached her tiny apartment, barely more than a room with a bed and a small kitchenette. She tossed her coat over the chair and collapsed onto the bed. The stack of unpaid bills on the table caught her eye. Rent was due in a week, and now she had no way to pay it. Amy barely slept that night. She kept replaying the moment in her head. Rick's smirk, the way he tossed the food into the trash, the quiet dignity on the veteran's face as he walked away. The injustice of it burned inside her. By morning, she had no choice but to go job hunting. She pulled on her warmest coat and stepped outside. She spent hours stopping by local businesses, filling out applications. But each conversation ended the same way. "We're not hiring right now." By noon, she found herself near Joe's diner again. She had no reason to go inside, but something made her linger. Across the street, the place looked the same, as if nothing had happened. Then a deep, rumbling noise filled the air. She turned toward the sound. A military convoy, jeeps, armored vehicles, rolled down the main road. The town rarely saw anything like this. People stepped out of stores, staring as the line of vehicles slowed, then stopped right in front of Joe's diner. Amy's stomach twisted. Inside the diner, Rick had been going about his day as usual. He had no regrets about firing Amy. If anything, he felt relieved. Employees were replaceable. The bell above the door jingled, and Rick turned, expecting another customer. Instead, a tall man in a decorated military uniform stepped inside. His presence commanded immediate attention. A dozen Marines marched in behind him, their combat boots striking the floor with an unshakable presence. The entire diner fell into a stunned silence. Rick blinked. "Can I help you?" The officer's sharp eyes scanned the diner. "We're looking for Amy Walker." The room went silent. Rick hesitated. She doesn't work here anymore." The officer's expression didn't change. "We know." Before Rick could ask anything else, the door opened again. Frank stepped inside. But this wasn't the same man from the night before. Today, he stood in full Marine dress uniform, ribbons and medals neatly displayed. Rick's jaw tightened. "Frank?" Frank didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he turned to the officer beside him. "This is Colonel James Carter," he said, his voice steady. "And these men, they're my brothers." Rick swallowed. I don't understand." Frank let out a slow breath. "Yesterday, a young woman showed me kindness when no one else would, and for that, she lost her job." The colonel took a step forward. "Frank Mitchell isn't just any veteran. He's a decorated war hero. He saved dozens of Marines in combat. And the way he was treated here is unacceptable." Rick's hands clenched. "Listen, I didn't know." "You didn't care," Frank interrupted. The tension in the room thickened. Then Colonel Carter turned toward the window and locked eyes with Amy, who was still standing outside. "Amy Walker," he called out. Amy froze. Every head turned to her. For a second, she considered walking away. But something in the colonel's voice, steady, firm but not unkind, made her feet move forward. Instead, she stepped inside the diner, the warmth of the room doing little to calm her nerves. Rick looked at her, his face pale. The colonel smiled slightly. "Miss Walker, we heard about what happened yesterday. More importantly, we heard about what you did for Frank." Amy glanced at Frank, who gave her a small nod. The colonel continued, "We need people like you. People who do the right thing even when there's no reward. We'd like to offer you a job." Amy's breath caught. "A job?" "Not in the military," he clarified. "We run a program that helps veterans transition back into civilian life. We need compassionate people to assist in counseling, job placement, and community support. You'd be helping people like Frank get back on their feet." Amy's mind reeled. Just yesterday, she had lost everything, and now the United States Marine Corps was offering her a job. Rick scoffed. "You can't be serious. She's just a waitress." Colonel Carter turned his gaze cold. "And yet, she did more for one of our men in a single night than you did in your entire life." Silence. Amy looked at the card in her hand, heart pounding. Less than 24 hours ago, she had lost everything. Now she had just been given an opportunity that could change her life forever. Amy stood frozen in the middle of the diner, Colonel Carter's business card still pressed between her fingers. The weight of the moment settled over her as the entire room remained silent. She had spent the last 24 hours wondering how she would move forward, but now the answer was standing right in front of her, dressed in Marine uniforms. Rick let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You can't just walk in here and offer her a job. She's not qualified for whatever it is you're offering." Colonel Carter barely spared him a glance. "On the contrary, Mr. Hudson," he replied coolly, "she is more qualified than you'll ever understand." He turned back to Amy, his expression softening. "We're not offering this as charity, Miss Walker. We need people like you. People with heart, integrity, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult." Amy swallowed hard. His words struck deep. She had always believed in doing the right thing, but it had rarely brought her reward. If anything, it had cost her more than it ever gave back. And yet here stood these men, powerful, respected, disciplined, telling her that it mattered, that she mattered. Frank stepped forward, his presence steady, grounding. "Amy, these men are the reason I'm still standing here today," he said, voice firm. "I served with them. I bled with them. And yesterday, for the first time in years, someone showed me the same loyalty I once gave to them." He met her eyes without wavering. "You didn't just buy me a meal. You reminded me that people still care." Rick scoffed loudly. "Oh, give me a break." Frank's jaw tightened, but it was Colonel Carter who responded, his tone calm but edged with something sharp. "You find this funny, Mr. Hudson?" Rick's smugness faltered. "You tossed away a good employee because she showed compassion to a man who served his country," Carter continued, voice low but commanding enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "And now the very same man is standing here, in full uniform, with his brothers at his side. Tell me, does that still seem funny to you?" Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. The colonel took a slow step forward, his presence overwhelming. "Let me make something very clear," he said, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Frank Mitchell is more than a veteran. He's a decorated war hero. He saved lives. He sacrificed more than you'll ever comprehend. And instead of honoring him, you humiliated him." His eyes flicked to Amy. "And instead of recognizing loyalty in your own employee, you threw her out." A murmur rippled through the diner. Customers who had been silent before whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. Rick shifted uncomfortably. I I didn't know," he stammered. "You didn't care," Frank corrected simply. "And that's worse." The room felt thick with tension. Rick, for the first time, looked truly unsettled. Amy finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. "I don't need an apology," she said, locking eyes with Rick, "because the truth is, I don't regret what I did. If I had to do it again, I would. And if that means I don't belong here, then so be it." Colonel Carter studied her for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why we want you on our team." Amy glanced down at the card still clutched in her hand, her fingers tightening around it. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind. Fear, anger, hopelessness. But now, standing here, she felt something new. Hope. "Where would I be working?" she asked cautiously. A hint of a smile touched the colonel's lips. "We have a program helping veterans transition back to civilian life. It's a nonprofit supported by the military. We provide housing, job training, counseling, everything men like Frank need to get back on their feet. And we need people like you to help run it." Amy's breath hitched. She had spent her life scraping by, working dead-end jobs just to survive. Now here they were, offering her something more, something meaningful. She glanced at Frank, who gave her a knowing nod. "You don't have to decide right now," Carter added gently. "Think about it. If you're interested, come see us tomorrow morning." Amy took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Then with newfound certainty, she nodded. "I'm in." Colonel Carter turned, leading his men toward the exit. Frank lingered behind, catching Amy's gaze one last time. "You deserve more than what this place gave you," he said quietly. And then he too walked out. The moment they were gone, the silence in the diner felt suffocating. Rick exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, that was dramatic." Amy turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Rick scoffed. "Oh, please. You think this changes anything? You think those guys are going to suddenly make your life perfect?" He gestured dismissively toward the door. "They'll forget about you in a week. People always do." Amy didn't respond immediately. Instead, she smiled, but it wasn't the forced, polite smile she had worn for customers. This one was different, stronger. "No," she said softly, "they won't." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the diner, stepping into the crisp evening air. She looked down at the business card once more, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt like her life was about to change. And for once, it was for the better. I'll do it, the colonel grinned. Welcome to the team. Over the next few weeks, Amy threw herself into the job. She learned fast how to navigate paperwork, how to coordinate with businesses, how to listen. She met veterans from all walks of life, some who had just returned from service, others who had been struggling for decades. Each of them had a story. Each of them had a battle they were still fighting. And for the first time, Amy felt like she was making a real difference. One afternoon, as she was organizing a job fair, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Frank standing there, looking sharper than she had ever seen him. He wore a neatly pressed polo shirt with the organization's logo on the chest, his hair trimmed, his posture strong. "Hey," he said. "Hey, yourself," Amy replied, smiling. "How's it going?" Frank exhaled, looking around at the busy room. "It's strange," he admitted. "For years I thought my life was over, and that no one cared. And then you came along." He met her gaze. "You changed everything, Amy." Her throat tightened. "I just did what anyone should do." "Maybe," Frank said, "but you were the only one who did it." Amy didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, she simply reached out and squeezed his hand. That evening, as she locked up the office, she stepped outside and looked at the horizon. The sky was painted in deep oranges and purples, the last rays of sunlight stretching across the town she had once thought of as nothing more than a stopping point in her life. Now it felt like something more, a second chance, a new beginning. She pulled her phone from her pocket and scrolled to Colonel Carter's contact. After a moment, she typed a message. "Thank you for believing in me." A reply came almost instantly. "We don't leave good people behind." Amy smiled, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She had spent years thinking she was just another face in the crowd, just another struggling worker trying to get by. Now she was part of something bigger, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she truly belonged. Amy sat in her office, staring at the stack of papers on her desk. It had been 6 months since she had taken the job at the Veteran Transition Center, and every day since had been a whirlwind. The work was exhausting, sometimes overwhelming, but it was also the most fulfilling thing she had ever done. She had gone from serving meals at a diner to helping people rebuild their lives. Outside, the hallways buzzed with activity. Veterans came and went, some meeting with job counselors, others attending therapy sessions, and some just stopping by for a cup of coffee and a conversation. Amy had quickly learned that for many of them, just having someone to listen was as important as any job placement or housing assistance. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Frank standing there, hands in his pockets, a familiar but more confident look on his face. "Got a minute?" he asked. Amy smiled and gestured to the chair across from her. "For you, always." Frank stepped inside and sat down, his gaze thoughtful. "Tomorrow's the big day," he said. Amy nodded. Tomorrow was the center's first official community event, an open house meant to connect veterans with employers, support groups, and the community. It was her project, and she had poured her heart into it. "Everything's ready," she said. "At least, I think it is." Frank chuckled. "You'll do great." She studied him for a moment. His transformation over the past months had been remarkable. When she first met him, he had been lost, just trying to survive another day. Now he was working at the center, mentoring younger veterans, and even leading an outreach program for those still struggling. "I'm proud of you, Frank," she said. His smile was small but genuine. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Amy shook her head. "No, you wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. You just needed someone to remind you of what you were capable of." Frank nodded, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "It goes both ways, you know. You helped me, but this place helped you too." Amy knew he was right. She had started this job thinking she was just helping others, but in reality, it had saved her too. She had spent so many years barely getting by, believing she had no real purpose. Now she woke up every morning knowing she was making a difference. A silence stretched between them, comfortable and understanding. Then Frank stood. "See you tomorrow," he said, heading for the door. Amy watched him go, then exhaled. Tomorrow was important, not just for the center, but for every veteran who would walk through those doors looking for a new beginning. The next day, Amy arrived early. The center had been transformed. Banners hung from the walls, booths were set up with job recruiters and support organizations, and volunteers bustled about, setting out refreshments and organizing paperwork. By noon, the first veterans began arriving. Amy watched as they moved from table to table, speaking with employers, connecting with resources. Some were hesitant, uncertain, but that's why she was here. She moved through the crowd, greeting people, answering questions. She saw Frank laughing with a group of younger veterans, sharing stories. She spotted Colonel Carter speaking with a government official, likely working on expanding the center's funding. Then she saw someone familiar at the entrance. A man stood just outside, hesitating, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure if he should step inside. Amy knew that look. She walked over and smiled warmly. "First time here?" The man glanced at her, then at the bustling room behind her. "Yeah," he admitted. "I wasn't sure if this place was for me." Amy nodded. "I get that, but let me tell you something. Everyone in there has felt the same way at some point, and every single one of them is glad they walked through that door." The man hesitated a moment longer, then exhaled and stepped inside. Amy watched as a volunteer greeted him, guiding him toward one of the booths. A feeling of quiet satisfaction filled her chest. This was why she was here. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Amy found herself standing outside, looking up at the darkening sky. Frank walked up beside her. "Not bad, huh?" She let out a soft laugh. "Not bad at all." Frank nodded toward the building. "You did that, you know. You built something real here, Amy." Amy shook her head. "We built something real." Frank smiled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded napkin. He handed it to her. Amy raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Something I held on to for a long time," Frank said. She unfolded it, and her breath caught. It was the receipt from the meal she had bought him that night at the diner. Amy looked up at Frank, her throat tight. "I kept it as a reminder," Frank said. "That night I thought I was invisible, and then you came along and proved me wrong." Amy swallowed hard. "Frank?" He smiled, clapping her on the shoulder before walking back inside. Amy looked down at the worn piece of paper in her hand, a single tear slipping down her cheek. That one meal had changed everything, and now she was going to keep changing lives, one person at a time. In today's fast-paced world, when politeness and kindness often feel like forgotten virtues, people are so caught up in their own struggles that they sometimes forget how much a small act of generosity can mean to someone else. Amy's story reminds us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, and it sometimes comes at a cost. But in the end, kindness always finds its way back. Many of us have faced moments where we had to choose between standing up for what's right or looking the other way. Maybe it was defending someone who was treated unfairly, helping a neighbor in need, or simply offering a kind word to a stranger. In a world that often rewards selfishness, being compassionate can feel like swimming against the tide. But as we saw in Amy's case, one simple meal changed everything, not just for the veterans she helped, but for her own life as well. This story is a powerful reminder that our actions matter, even when no one seems to notice at first. The kindness we show today could be the turning point in someone else's life tomorrow. If we all took a moment to look out for those around us, the world would be a much better place. Do you believe in the power of kindness? If so, hit 1 in the comments. And if you want more incredible stories that prove humanity still has hope, subscribe now. Let's make kindness go viral. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where real-life heroes prove that doing good is never in vain. Because kindness isn't just a choice, it's what makes us truly human.